The scorching afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail as Penelope Evans stumbled forward, her once fine dress hanging in tatters around her emaciated frame. 3 days without food, 2 without water, and the Nebraska Territory of 1874 showed no mercy to a woman traveling alone. As her vision blurred and the horizon tilted sideways, her last conscious thought was of the approaching thunder of hooves and the silhouette of a rider against the relentless sun. Samuel Drake had been riding the Western Trail for the better part of a decade, his lean frame and weathered face telling the story of a man who'd seen too much too young. At 26, he'd already built a reputation as one of the finest horse traders this side of the Mississippi. When he spotted the woman collapsing in a cloud of prairie dust, something beyond mere duty propelled him forward. "Whoa there!" Samuel pulled his stallion to a halt, leaping from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. He knelt beside the unconscious woman, her delicate features smudged with dirt and her golden hair matted with sweat. Pressing 2 fingers to her neck, he felt a faint pulse. "Miss, can you hear me?" He cradled her head, noting the hollowness of her cheeks and the way her collarbones jutted painfully beneath her skin. Samuel had seen starvation before, recognized its cruel signature on human flesh. Without hesitation, he lifted her onto his horse, mounting behind her to keep her from falling. Her body was frighteningly light against his chest as he urged his horse toward the homestead he'd purchased 6 months prior, a day's ride from the nearest town. By the time they arrived, the woman had stirred only briefly, mumbling incoherently before slipping back into unconsciousness. Samuel carried her inside the modest cabin he'd built with his own hands, laying her gently on his bed. He worked quickly, building a fire and setting water to boil. He knew better than to offer too much too soon. From his saddlebag, he retrieved a small tin of broth that he'd planned for his own supper. He warmed it slowly, then moistened a clean cloth with water and pressed it to her parched lips. Penelope's eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding their emerald depths. The sensation of moisture on her lips triggered a desperate response, and she instinctively sucked at the cloth. "Easy now," Samuel murmured, his voice gentle. "You're safe. Take it slow." Fear flashed across her face as she registered the unfamiliar surroundings and the stranger beside her. She tried to sit up but lacked the strength to do more than raise her head. "Who?" Her voice emerged as little more than a rasp. "Samuel Drake, madam, found you collapsed on the trail about 20 miles back." He dipped the cloth again and offered it to her. "Can you tell me your name?" Penelope hesitated, weighing her limited options. "Penelope," she whispered finally. "Penelope Evans. Miss Evans, you're suffering from hunger and thirst. I've got some broth cooling. Think you can manage a few sips?" She nodded weakly, and Samuel gently helped her to a semi-sitting position, supporting her with one arm while bringing a spoonful of broth to her lips with the other. The moment the warm liquid touched her tongue, Penelope felt tears spring to her eyes. She hadn't realized how desperately her body craved nourishment until that moment. "Slowly now," Samuel cautioned as she tried to gulp the broth. "Too much too fast will make you sick." Penelope complied, allowing him to feed her 1 spoonful at a time until half the broth was gone. With even that small amount, color began returning to her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice stronger now. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Samuel's expression darkened. "We both know what would have happened, Miss Evans. But there's no need to dwell on that now. You're safe here." As he helped her lie back down, Samuel couldn't help but notice the fine quality of what remained of her clothing, despite its current state. "If you don't mind my asking, what brings a lady like yourself out to these parts alone?" Penelope turned her face away, shadows clouding her expression. "I was traveling to meet family in Colorado Territory. The stagecoach was robbed 3 days ago. The bandits took everything: money, food, my luggage. They left the passengers stranded. The others headed back east. I decided to continue forward." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "That was mighty brave or mighty foolish." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Perhaps both. I had my reasons." "Well, Miss Evans, you're welcome to rest here until you've recovered your strength. My nearest neighbor is 10 miles away and town's a full day's ride. Not much in the way of comforts, but you'll have food, water, and safety." "You're very kind, Mr. Drake." "Samuel," he corrected gently. "Out here formalities seem a mite unnecessary." Samuel, she repeated, her eyelids growing heavy, then you must call me Penelope. As she drifted back to sleep, Samuel sat beside the bed, studying the woman he'd rescued. There was more to her story than she was sharing. He'd bet his best horse on it, but that was her business. For now, his only concern was helping her regain her strength. The next morning, Penelope awoke to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet movement. She opened her eyes to find Samuel placing a plate of food on the small table beside the bed. "Morning," he said, his voice low. "Thought you might be hungry." Penelope struggled to sit up, surprised to find she had more strength than the previous day. "I am, thank you." The plate contained a small portion of beans, a piece of cornbread, and what appeared to be jerky that had been softened in hot water. Simple trail food, but to Penelope it looked like a feast. "Still need to take it slow," Samuel advised, helping her adjust the pillow behind her back. "Your stomach needs time to remember how to handle food." She nodded, carefully taking a small bite of the cornbread. The simple flavor was exquisite after days of nothing. "May I ask what year it is?" Samuel asked casually, though his eyes were watchful. Penelope looked up, puzzled. 1874, of course. "And the president, Grant." Why these questions? Samuel's expression relaxed slightly. "Sometimes starvation and exposure can affect the mind, just making sure you're fully with us." Penelope bristled slightly. "My mind is perfectly sound, Mr. Drake. My body may have failed me temporarily, but my wits remain intact." A smile tugged at the corner of Samuel's mouth. "So I see." "And it's Samuel, remember?" "Samuel," she conceded, taking another small bite. After a few moments of silence, she ventured, "Is this your home?" He nodded. "Such as it is. Bought the land 6 months ago, built the cabin myself." Penelope glanced around the simple but tidy one-room structure. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a small table with 2 chairs sat near the only window, and a chest of drawers stood opposite the bed. Samuel's bedroll was laid out on the floor near the door. "It's nice," she offered. Samuel laughed, a surprisingly warm sound. "It's basic, but it serves. I'm rarely here anyway, usually on the trail trading horses." "Is that your profession, horse trading?" "Among other things. I've tried my hand at most everything since coming west. Panning for gold, cattle driving, even tried bounty hunting for a spell." He grimaced. "Didn't take to that last one much. And now I'm settling down, breeding horses, building something that might last." He gestured to the window, where outside a small corral contained several fine-looking horses. "Got some of the best stock this side of the Mississippi. Hoping to expand, maybe bring in some Arabian blood to strengthen the line." Penelope listened, fascinated despite herself by the passion in his voice. "You know a great deal about horses." "Had to learn. They've been my livelihood and my companions for most of my life." He hesitated, then asked, "What about you? What awaits you in Colorado Territory?" Penelope's expression closed off. "As I said, family." Samuel nodded, accepting her reticence. "Well, you're welcome to stay as long as you need to recover. Once you're stronger, I can take you to town. The stagecoach comes through once a week." "That's very generous of you. Just doing what anyone would do." Penelope gave him a knowing look. "We both know that's not true. Most men finding a woman alone would have." She trailed off, her implication clear. Samuel's jaw tightened. "I'm not most men, Miss Evans." "Penelope," she reminded him softly. "Penelope," he acknowledged, standing and taking her now empty plate. "Rest now. We'll try some more food this evening." Over the next 3 days, Penelope's strength gradually returned. By the 4th day, she was able to sit at the table for meals and even venture outside to sit on the rough-hewn bench beside the cabin door. Samuel maintained a respectful distance, providing for her needs but giving her space. On the 5th morning, Penelope emerged from the cabin to find Samuel working with a spirited young mare in the corral. She watched, mesmerized, as he moved with the animal, his body language conveying both authority and gentleness. The mare, initially skittish, gradually relaxed under his guidance. "You have a way with them," Penelope called out when he finished the session. Samuel looked up, surprised to see her standing there. "They're honest creatures. They respond to how you treat them. Unlike people," she suggested with a small smile. "Sometimes," he agreed, wiping his brow as he approached. "How are you feeling today?" "Much better. Strong enough to be useful, I hope. I'd like to help around here, earn my keep." Samuel shook his head. "That's not necessary." "It is to me," Penelope insisted. "I've never been comfortable with charity. After a moment's consideration, Samuel nodded. All right, there's laundry that needs doing if you're up to it. Lead the way, she said, grateful for the opportunity to repay his kindness. As Penelope worked at the washtub behind the cabin, she found herself humming softly. It had been a long time since she'd felt peaceful enough to make music, even so simple a form. The rhythmic work was soothing, and the warm sunshine on her back was a blessing after days of weakness. Samuel returned from checking his fence line to find her hanging the last of his shirts on a line strung between two pines. He paused, struck by the domesticity of the scene and how natural she looked there, her golden hair catching the afternoon light. You didn't have to do all that, he said, dismounting. Penelope turned, pushing a strand of hair from her face. I wanted to. It feels good to be useful again. Samuel noticed her flushed cheeks and the slight tremble in her hands. You've overdone it. Come sit down. She started to protest, but swayed slightly on her feet, confirming his assessment. Samuel was at her side in an instant, his arm around her waist to steady her. I'm fine, she insisted, even as she leaned against him. Stubborn woman, he muttered, helping her to the bench. Stay here. I'll fetch you some water. When he returned with a cup, their fingers brushed as she took it from him. A spark of awareness passed between them, and for a moment neither spoke. Thank you, Penelope finally said, breaking the tension. Samuel cleared his throat. We should go into town tomorrow. You need proper clothing, and I'm sure you're eager to continue your journey. An unexpected pang of regret shot through Penelope at the thought of leaving. Yes, of course. We'll leave at first light. It's a full day's ride. Penelope nodded, sipping her water to hide her conflicted feelings. In less than a week, this rough cabin and its quiet owner had begun to feel more like home than anywhere she'd been in years. That evening, as they shared a simple meal of rabbit stew, Samuel asked, Can you ride? Yes, my father insisted all his children learn. Though it's been some time since I've been on horseback. I'll saddle the bay gelding for you. He's steady, won't give you any trouble. What made you decide to settle here? Penelope asked, changing the subject. It seems very isolated. Samuel considered the question. After the war, I couldn't stomach crowds anymore. Too much noise, too many people with expectations. Out here, a man can breathe. Be judged by what he does, not who his family was or which side he fought for. You fought in the war? Penelope asked softly. Samuel nodded, his expression distant. Union cavalry, enlisted at 17, served until Appomattox. You were just a boy. We all were, on both sides. He shook his head as if to dispel the memories. What about you? Where's home? Penelope hesitated. Philadelphia originally, but it hasn't felt like home in a long time. And your family in Colorado? My aunt, she said after a pause. My father's sister. She's all I have left now. Something in her tone made Samuel suspect there was more to the story, but he didn't press. Everyone out west had something they were running from or toward. It wasn't his place to pry. They set out for town just as dawn was breaking the next morning. Penelope wore one of Samuel's shirts over her tattered dress, the sleeves rolled up multiple times and the collar gaping around her neck. She'd fashioned a makeshift belt from a strip of fabric to keep it from billowing around her. Despite the ill-fitting clothes, she sat straight in the saddle, handling the gelding with the confidence of someone who had indeed been taught to ride properly. You ride well, Samuel observed as they set a steady pace eastward. My father believed a lady should be accomplished in all things. Riding, music, languages, even mathematics. He was progressive in his thinking. He sounds like an unusual man. He was, Penelope agreed, a shadow crossing her face. He died 3 years ago, influenza. I'm sorry, Samuel said simply. They rode in companionable silence for several miles, the rhythm of the horses, hooves a soothing counterpoint to the calls of birds and the whisper of wind through the tall grass. Penelope found herself relaxing in the saddle, enjoying the freedom of the open prairie. Look there, Samuel said suddenly, pointing toward a distant rise. Wild horses. Penelope followed his gesture and caught sight of a small herd moving across the horizon, their forms dark against the sky. They're beautiful. Freedom incarnate, Samuel agreed. Been trying to catch that stallion for 2 years now. He indicated a large black horse at the front of the herd. Magnificent animal, smart as a whip. Perhaps he's meant to be free, Penelope suggested. Samuel glanced at her, a new respect in his eyes. Perhaps. But what a foundation he'd make for a breeding program. As they continued their journey, Penelope found herself increasingly aware of the man riding beside her. There was an integrity about Samuel Drake that drew her, a straightforward honesty that contrasted sharply with the men she'd known back east. His hands were calloused from honest work, his face weathered by sun and wind rather than politics and ambition. By midday, they stopped to rest the horses by a small creek. Samuel spread a blanket in the shade of a cottonwood tree and produced bread, cheese, and dried apples from his saddlebag. "Not much, but it'll keep us going," he said, offering Penelope the first portion. "It's perfect," she assured him, settling on the blanket and gratefully accepting the food. After eating in silence for a few minutes, she ventured, "Have you always been on your own?" Samuel considered the question. "Since the war, yes. Before that, I had family in Kentucky, farm folk mostly." "Do you ever write to them?" A shadow crossed his face. "There's no one left to write to. Farm was burned during the war, parents died of typhoid in '63, brother fell at Gettysburg." "I'm so sorry," Penelope said softly, impulsively reaching out to touch his hand. Samuel looked down at her small hand resting on his, then met her gaze. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of shared loss. "It was a long time ago," he said finally, though they both knew that some wounds never fully healed. They resumed their journey shortly after, the terrain gradually changing as they approached the town of Cedar Ridge. By late afternoon, the first buildings came into view, simple structures of wood and stone that comprised the frontier settlement. Penelope felt a strange reluctance as they rode down the main street. After the peace of Samuel's homestead, the town seemed chaotic and overwhelming, despite its modest size. Several people called greetings to Samuel as they passed, eyeing Penelope with undisguised curiosity. "General store's just ahead," Samuel told her. "Martha Wilson runs it. She's a good woman, can help you with whatever you need." They dismounted in front of a two-story building with a wooden sign proclaiming Wilson's Mercantile. Samuel tied the horses to the hitching post and offered Penelope his arm to escort her inside. The store was well stocked for a frontier establishment, with everything from tools and firearms to fabric and foodstuffs. A plump, gray-haired woman looked up from behind the counter as they entered. "Samuel Drake, haven't seen you in nearly a month." Her gaze shifted to Penelope, taking in her disheveled appearance and borrowed clothing. "And who might this be, Mrs. Wilson?" "This is Miss Penelope Evans. She's had some misfortune on her travels and needs assistance with new clothing and supplies." Martha Wilson's expression softened with understanding. "Of course, dear, come with me." She gestured for Penelope to follow her to a section of the store displaying fabric and ready-made garments. Samuel cleared his throat. "I'll see to the horses and arrange rooms at the boarding house. Will you be all right here?" Penelope nodded, oddly reluctant to see him go. "Yes, thank you." As Samuel left, Martha Wilson turned to Penelope with a kindly but assessing gaze. "Now, let's get you properly outfitted, and while we do, you can tell me how you really came to be traveling with Samuel Drake in his shirt." 2 hours later, Penelope emerged from the store feeling like a new woman. Dressed in a simple but well-made blue calico dress, with proper undergarments, a shawl, and sturdy boots, she felt restored to some semblance of dignity. Martha Wilson had helped her select fabric for another dress, as well as necessary toiletries and personal items. Samuel was waiting outside, leaning against a post. He straightened when he saw her, his expression unreadable as he took in her transformation. "You look." He began, then seemed to think better of whatever he'd been about to say. "Better." Penelope couldn't help but smile at his awkwardness. "Thank you, I feel much better. I've arranged rooms at Mrs. Hollister's boarding house, best place in town, and I've inquired about the stagecoach. One's due through tomorrow afternoon, heading west." The news, which should have been welcome, struck Penelope with unexpected force. "So soon." "Unless you'd prefer to stay longer." There was a careful neutrality in Samuel's tone that Penelope couldn't quite interpret. "No, that's good, thank you." She forced a smile. "I should continue my journey." Samuel nodded, his expression giving nothing away. "Mrs. Hollister will be serving supper soon." "Shall we?" The boarding house was a tidy two-story building at the end of the main street. Mrs. Hollister, a widow in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner, showed them to adjacent rooms on the second floor. Supper's at 6 sharp, she informed them. No exceptions. Yes, madam, Samuel replied with the deference of a man who knew better than to argue. Alone in her room, Penelope sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the past week. She'd been so focused on survival that she hadn't allowed herself to think beyond the immediate future. Now, faced with continuing her journey, she found herself hesitating. The truth was, there was no aunt in Colorado. That had been a convenient fiction told to a stranger who'd saved her life. In reality, Penelope was running from a forced marriage to a man 30 years her senior, a business arrangement made by her stepmother after her father's death to settle family debts. She'd fled Philadelphia with only what she could carry and the small inheritance her mother had left her, determined to make a new life in the West. The stagecoach robbery had been a devastating setback, leaving her penniless and desperate, if not for Samuel. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Samuel standing there, hat in hand. "Supper's ready," he said. "Mrs. Hollister doesn't tolerate tardiness." "Of course," Penelope replied, following him downstairs to the dining room. The meal was hearty frontier fare roast beef, potatoes, and fresh baked bread. Besides Penelope and Samuel, there were 4 other boarders: a traveling salesman, a young schoolteacher, and an elderly couple passing through on their way to visit grandchildren in California. Conversation flowed around the table, with Mrs. Hollister expertly drawing out her guests while serving generous portions of food. Penelope contributed little, acutely aware of Samuel sitting beside her, his arm occasionally brushing hers as he reached for the bread. "And what brings you to Cedar Ridge, Miss Evans?" the schoolteacher asked during a lull in conversation. "I'm just passing through," Penelope replied, "on my way to Colorado Territory." "Alone?" the salesman raised his eyebrows. "That's mighty unusual for a lady." "Miss Evans has had some difficulties on her journey," Samuel interjected, his tone discouraging further inquiry. "She'll be continuing west tomorrow." "Well, you're fortunate Mr. Drake found you," Mrs. Hollister remarked. "Not many men would have been so honorable." Penelope felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Yes, I'm very grateful." After supper, Samuel suggested a walk to settle their meal. The evening was mild, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of prairie wildflowers. They strolled to the edge of town in comfortable silence, eventually stopping at a small rise overlooking the settlement. "It's beautiful here," Penelope said softly, gazing at the vast expanse of prairie bathed in the golden light of sunset. "It has its moments," Samuel agreed, standing beside her. "Different from Philadelphia, I imagine. Very different, but in a good way. It feels freer somehow." Samuel turned to look at her. "May I ask you something, Penelope?" She tensed slightly but nodded. "There's no aunt in Colorado, is there?" Penelope's breath caught. She considered lying, maintaining the fiction she'd created, but something in Samuel's steady gaze made her reconsider. "No," she admitted quietly. "There isn't." Samuel nodded, unsurprised. "I thought as much." "You don't have to tell me what you're running from. Lord knows we've all got our reasons for coming west. But you should know that stagecoach travel isn't cheap. Do you have funds?" Penelope's silence was answer enough. "I see," Samuel said. "And what was your plan once you reached Colorado?" "I don't know," Penelope confessed, embarrassed by how unprepared she sounded. "Find work, I suppose. I'm educated. I could teach or work as a clerk. Those positions aren't easy to come by, especially for a woman alone. What would you have me do?" Penelope asked, a hint of defiance entering her voice. "Return east. I can't do that." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "You could stay here in Cedar Ridge or at my homestead," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "As my housekeeper, if you'd like. I could use the help, and you'd have a safe place to live while you decide what comes next." Penelope stared at him, searching his face for any hint of improper intentions. She found none, only straightforward honesty and perhaps a touch of vulnerability. "Why would you do that?" she asked softly. Samuel looked away, his gaze returning to the horizon. "Maybe I'm tired of being alone, or maybe I just recognize someone else who's lost everything and is trying to find their way." The simple truth of his words touched something deep within Penelope. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll consider it," Samuel replied. "That's all I'm asking." As they walked back to the boarding house in the gathering dusk, Penelope found herself wrestling with conflicting emotions. Samuel's offer was generous and practical, but was it wise to bind herself to another man's household after fighting so hard for independence? Yet the alternative, continuing west with no money and no real destination, seemed increasingly foolhardy. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed at Mrs. Hollister's, Penelope made her decision. She would accept Samuel's offer, at least temporarily. She could earn her keep, save whatever wages he paid her, and eventually move on when she was better prepared. It was a sensible solution to her immediate problems. Yet as she drifted towards sleep, Penelope couldn't ignore the small voice that whispered there might be another reason she was reluctant to leave, a reason with broad shoulders, kind eyes, and a quiet strength that made her feel safe for the first time in years. The next morning, Penelope found Samuel at breakfast, already dressed for travel. She took a seat beside him, aware of Mrs. Hollister's curious gaze from the head of the table. "I've been thinking about your offer," Penelope said quietly. Samuel looked up from his coffee. "And I'd like to accept if it's still open." Something like relief flickered across his features. "It is." "As your housekeeper," Penelope clarified, conscious of the other diners who might be listening, "with fair wages and the understanding that the arrangement is temporary." "Of course," Samuel agreed readily. "We can discuss terms on the ride back." After breakfast, while Samuel settled their bill with Mrs. Hollister, Penelope returned to Wilson's Mercantile to collect the second dress that had been hastily altered for her. Martha Wilson was alone in the store when she entered. "So you're heading back with Samuel instead of taking the stage," the older woman observed shrewdly. "News travels fast," Penelope remarked. "It's a small town, dear. Nothing much happens without everyone knowing." Martha studied her for a moment. "He's a good man, Samuel Drake, one of the best I've known." "I'm just going to work as his housekeeper," Penelope clarified quickly. Martha's expression was knowing. "Of course, still, it's an unusual arrangement. People will talk." "Let them," Penelope replied with more confidence than she felt. "I know the truth of it, and so does Mr. Drake." The older woman nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit. Now I've taken the liberty of adding a few items I thought you might need." She handed Penelope a package wrapped in brown paper, just some practical things for a woman living out on a homestead. Penelope started to protest, but Martha waved her off. "Samuel's account covers it," he insisted. Touched by the thoughtfulness, Penelope accepted the package. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson." "Martha, please. And you're welcome to visit anytime you come to town. It's good to have another woman to talk to occasionally." By mid-morning, Penelope and Samuel were on the trail back to his homestead. The day was clear and mild, perfect for traveling. They rode side by side, their horses maintaining an easy pace. "I hope you won't regret your decision," Samuel said after they'd been riding for an hour. "I hope you won't regret your offer," Penelope countered with a small smile. "Unlikely. My cooking is terrible and the cabin could use a woman's touch." Penelope laughed, surprising herself with the ease of it. "I should warn you, I'm not much of a cook either. My family had servants." Samuel glanced at her, curious. "What changed?" Penelope hesitated, then decided there was little point in concealing her past now. "My father was a successful merchant. After my mother died when I was 12, he raised me and my brother alone. He was unconventional, believed women should be educated, have opportunities beyond marriage. He sent me to a progressive women's academy." "That explains your independent spirit," Samuel observed. "Perhaps. When father died 3 years ago, we discovered he'd made some poor investments. Most of the family fortune was gone. My brother tried to salvage what he could, but he had a family of his own to support. My father remarried when I was 16, arranged a marriage for me to settle family debts." "To a man you didn't love," Samuel guessed. "To a man 3 times my age who'd buried 3 wives already," Penelope corrected, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "A business arrangement, nothing more. I refused. We quarreled. I left with what little money my mother had left me in trust." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, processing her story. "That took courage, or foolishness," Penelope admitted. "I wasn't prepared for how difficult it would be. The money didn't last as long as I'd hoped, and then the stagecoach robbery. And now here you are," Samuel concluded. "Yes. Here I am." Penelope looked around at the vast prairie stretching in all directions. "It's not where I expected to be, but perhaps it's where I need to be for now." They rode in companionable silence for several miles before Samuel spoke again. "I'll pay you $15 a month plus room and board. It's not much, but it's fair." "That's very generous," Penelope said, genuinely surprised. It was more than she'd expected. "You'll earn it," Samuel assured her. "Homestead life isn't easy, especially as winter approaches." Winter. Penelope hadn't considered the seasons. How bad does it get here? Bad enough. Snowstorms that can last for days. Temperatures cold enough to freeze a man solid if he's caught outside. Seeing her alarmed expression, he added, "But the cabin's sturdy and we'll have plenty of firewood and supplies." Penelope repeated softly, testing the word. It had been a long time since she'd been part of any we. They reached the homestead as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. Penelope was surprised by the wave of relief she felt at the sight of the simple cabin. After less than a week, it already felt familiar, almost welcoming. Samuel helped her dismount, his hands strong and steady at her waist. "Welcome back," he said, his voice gruff. "Thank you," Penelope replied, suddenly shy. This was different now, not a temporary shelter but her home, at least for the foreseeable future. That evening, they established a routine that would serve them in the weeks to come. Penelope prepared a simple meal while Samuel tended to the horses and checked the property. They ate together at the small table, sharing the events of the day and their plans for tomorrow. "I'll clear out the storage room for you," Samuel said as they finished eating. "It's small, but it'll give you some privacy. Take me a few days to build a proper bed." "I can continue to use your bed," Penelope offered. "I don't mind sleeping on the floor for a while." Samuel shook his head firmly. "No woman under my roof is going to sleep on the floor while I take the bed. It's not right." "But no arguments, Penelope. I've slept under the stars more nights than I can count. A bedroll by the fire is luxury compared to some places I've rested." His tone brooked no disagreement, so Penelope simply nodded her acceptance. "Very well, but I insist on doing my share of the work around here." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Samuel assured her with a small smile. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that became increasingly comfortable for both of them. Penelope took charge of the cabin, cleaning and organizing with an efficiency that transformed the simple structure into a true home. She discovered an unexpected talent for cooking over an open hearth, experimenting with the limited ingredients available to create meals that Samuel praised enthusiastically. For his part, Samuel worked from dawn until dusk, tending his horses, repairing fences, and preparing the homestead for the coming winter. He built Penelope a small but comfortable bed for the storage room, which he'd emptied and cleaned to serve as her bedroom. He even constructed a rough privacy screen for her to change behind. Using leftover lumber and fabric Penelope had purchased in town, in the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying the comfortable silence between them. Samuel taught Penelope to play checkers, and she proved to be a quick study, soon winning as many games as she lost. Occasionally, Samuel would read aloud from one of the few books he owned, mostly practical guides to farming and horse breeding, but also a well-worn volume of Shakespeare's sonnets that had been his mother's. As October gave way to November, the weather turned sharply colder. The first snow came earlier than expected, a swirling white curtain that descended without warning one afternoon while Samuel was checking the far pasture. Penelope watched anxiously from the cabin door as the snowfall intensified, obscuring the landscape beyond the corral. When she finally spotted Samuel's figure emerging from the whiteness, leading his horse by the reins, relief flooded through her with surprising force. "You're back," she said as he stomped snow from his boots at the door. "Barely," Samuel replied, his face reddened by the cold. "Storm came in faster than I expected. Had to shelter in the south ravine for a while until I could see enough to make it back." Without thinking, Penelope reached out to brush snow from his shoulders. "You must be freezing. Come sit by the fire, I'll make coffee." Samuel caught her hand as she turned away, his fingers cold against her warm skin. "I'm all right, Penelope. No need to fuss." Their eyes met, and something shifted in the air between them. Penelope became acutely aware of how close they were standing, of the strength in his hand that still held hers, of the snowflakes melting in his dark hair. "I was worried," she admitted softly. Samuel's expression softened. "I've weathered worse storms than this, even so." Penelope gently extracted her hand from his. Coffee will help warm you up. As she busied herself at the hearth, she could feel Samuel's gaze following her, and she wondered if he too was becoming aware of the changing nature of their relationship. What had begun as a practical arrangement was evolving into something neither of them had anticipated. The snowstorm raged for 2 days, confining them to the cabin. They passed the time with checkers, reading, and conversation. Samuel shared stories of his travels across the frontier, painting vivid pictures of mountains, deserts, and plains that Penelope had only read about in books. In turn, Penelope told him about her life in Philadelphia, the music and art, the lectures and social gatherings that had once filled her days. She described her father's library, with its thousands of volumes, and the hours she'd spent lost in worlds created by Austen, Dickens, and Hugo. "You must miss it," Samuel observed during a lull in conversation. "The culture, the civilization," Penelope considered his words. "I miss certain aspects, the bookshops, the concerts, but not the constraints, the expectations. The way a woman's worth is measured by her marriage prospects rather than her character or abilities." "Is it so different out here?" Samuel asked. "Women still marry for security." "Perhaps, but there seems to be more possibility. Women run businesses, own property. There's work that needs doing and less concern about who does it so long as it gets done." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "I've known some remarkable women on the frontier, tougher than most men I've ridden with, like Martha Wilson," Penelope suggested. "Martha's one. And there's a woman over in Willow Creek who runs the best saloon in 3 counties. Came out as a laundress after her husband died in the war, saved every penny, and bought the place when the owner got himself shot over a card game." Penelope laughed. "Now that's a story I'd like to hear in full." "Maybe I'll take you there sometime," Samuel offered. "Willow Creek's a 2-day ride, but Maggie's cooking is worth the journey." The casual suggestion of future travel together hung in the air between them, neither acknowledging the implication that their arrangement might extend beyond the immediate future. When the storm finally passed, the world outside was transformed. A blanket of pristine white covered the prairie, the snow deep enough in places to reach the middle of Samuel's thigh. The horses were restless after 2 days confined to the stable, snorting and pawing at the ground when Samuel led them out to the corral. Penelope ventured outside, wrapped in her shawl and a heavy coat Samuel had lent her. The air was bitingly cold but exhilarating, the silence broken only by the soft crunch of snow beneath her boots. "It's beautiful," she said, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Samuel, busy breaking ice in the water trough, looked up at her words. For a moment he seemed to forget his task, his gaze fixed on Penelope standing in the snow, her cheeks flushed with cold and her eyes bright with wonder. "Yes," he agreed quietly. "Beautiful." As November progressed, the days grew shorter and the temperatures continued to drop. Samuel spent long hours ensuring the homestead was prepared for the harsh winter ahead, splitting and stacking firewood, reinforcing the stable, and hunting to supplement their stored provisions. Penelope proved herself invaluable, preserving the meat Samuel brought home, making soap from rendered fat and lye, and even learning to mend harnesses and tack with Samuel's guidance. Her city-bred hands grew calloused from work, and her face tanned from the occasional clear days spent outdoors. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Samuel cleared his throat awkwardly. "I need to ride into town tomorrow for supplies, last chance before winter sets in properly." "I'll prepare a list of what we need," Penelope replied, already mentally inventorying their stores. "I was thinking you might want to come along," Samuel suggested. "It'll be your last opportunity to change your mind about staying here for the winter." Penelope looked up sharply. "Do you want me to leave?" "No," Samuel answered quickly. "God, no, but I want you to have the choice. Once the deep snow comes, we'll be isolated until spring. It's not an easy life, especially for someone who's used to civilization." "I'm not afraid of hardship, Samuel. I know that, but winter on the prairie is different. Weeks, sometimes months, with no company but each other. Storms that can rage for days, cold that cuts to the bone." He hesitated. "Some people find the isolation difficult." Penelope studied him in the firelight, understanding the concern behind his words. "Are you speaking from experience?" Samuel's gaze dropped to the flames. My first winter out here, I nearly lost my mind. Talked to the horses more than was strictly healthy, even had conversations with the coffee pot a time or two. A smile tugged at Penelope's lips. Did it answer? Depended on how much whiskey I'd had, he admitted with a rueful chuckle. Penelope reached across the small space between their chairs to touch his arm. I'm not afraid of the winter, Samuel, or of being here with you. His eyes met hers, searching. You're sure? I'm sure. The trip to Cedar Ridge the next day was challenging but uneventful. The snow had packed down on the main trail, making travel possible if slow. They arrived by midday, the town looking festive with garlands of evergreen decorating the main street in anticipation of the upcoming Christmas season. While Samuel arranged for supplies at the general store, Penelope visited Martha Wilson, who greeted her warmly. You're looking well, Martha observed, pouring tea for them both in the back room of the store. Frontier life seems to agree with you. It does, surprisingly, Penelope admitted. I've never worked so hard in my life, but there's satisfaction in it. And how are things with Samuel? Martha asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. Penelope felt a flush rise to her cheeks. Fine, he's been very kind. Just kind, Martha raised an eyebrow. Martha, it's not like that. I'm his housekeeper. MMM. The older woman sipped her tea. And is that all you want to be? The question caught Penelope off guard. I haven't thought about it. Haven't you? Martha's knowing look suggested she thought otherwise. Samuel Drake has been alone too long. He needs a partner, not just a housekeeper. I don't know if that's what either of us wants, Penelope protested weakly. Don't you? Martha challenged gently. I see the way you look at him when you think no one's watching, and he's not much better at hiding his feelings. Penelope stared into her teacup, her thoughts in turmoil. Yes, there had been moments glances held a beat too long. Hands touching accidentally then lingering, conversations that deepened in the firelight, but she'd attributed them to the natural intimacy that developed between people sharing close quarters. Even if there were. Feelings, Penelope said carefully, I have nothing to offer him, no dowry, no family connections, just myself. Martha reached across the table to pat Penelope's hand. Out here, that's all that matters. A strong woman who can stand beside a man, share his burdens, and bring joy to his life. Samuel's wise enough to recognize that value. Before Penelope could respond, the bell over the shop door jangled, announcing a customer. Martha rose with a sigh. Think about what I've said, dear. Life's too short to deny the heart what it truly wants. The ride back to the homestead was quiet, both Penelope and Samuel lost in their own thoughts. The supplies were secured behind Samuel's saddle and on a small travois he'd constructed for additional items. As they crested the final rise before the homestead came into view, Samuel reined his horse to a stop. Everything all right, you've been quiet, Penelope forced a smile. Just tired, it's been a long day. Samuel studied her face for a moment, then nodded, accepting her explanation though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. That night, after they'd unpacked the supplies and settled in for the evening, Penelope found herself watching Samuel as he cleaned his rifle by the fire. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, strong and capable yet surprisingly gentle with the weapon. Would those hands be as gentle with a woman? The unbidden thought brought heat to Penelope's cheeks, and she quickly busied herself with mending to hide her confusion. Samuel glanced up, catching her hastily averted gaze. Penny for your thoughts, the use of the diminutive the first time he'd called her anything, but Penelope caught her by surprise. I was just thinking about what Martha said today. Oh, Samuel set aside the rifle. And what wisdom did Mrs. Wilson impart? Penelope hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. She thinks I'm well suited to frontier life. She's right about that, Samuel agreed. You've taken to it better than most city folk I've known, she also thinks. Penelope began, then faltered. Yes, Samuel prompted. When she didn't continue, Penelope shook her head. Nothing important. Samuel looked as though he might press the issue, but after a moment he simply nodded and returned to his task. The opportunity for honesty passed, leaving Penelope both relieved and oddly disappointed. The first major blizzard of the season struck 3 days later, a howling white fury that confined them to the cabin for nearly a week. Samuel ventured out only to tend to the horses and check that the woodpile remained accessible. Penelope kept the fire burning, prepared meals from their stores, and tried not to worry each time Samuel disappeared into the swirling snow. On the fourth night of the storm, the wind rose to a deafening pitch, rattling the shutters and sending drafts whistling through the smallest cracks in the cabin walls. Despite the roaring fire, the temperature inside dropped steadily as the night wore on. Penelope, huddled under every blanket she possessed in her small room, could hear Samuel adding logs to the fire in the main room. Finally, when her teeth began to chatter uncontrollably, she wrapped the thickest blanket around her shoulders and ventured out. Samuel looked up as she appeared, his expression concerned. "You should be sleeping." "Too cold," Penelope admitted, moving closer to the fire. "I can't feel my feet." Without hesitation, Samuel rose and guided her to his chair closest to the hearth. "Sit here, I'll make some coffee." "It's the middle of the night," Penelope protested weakly. "And neither of us is sleeping anyway," Samuel countered, already moving to hang the coffee pot over the fire. As the aroma of brewing coffee filled the cabin, Samuel pulled his own bedroll closer to the fire. "You can have this tonight." "It's warmer out here." "There's no need for you to give up your bed," Penelope objected. I sleep out here most nights anyway." Penelope looked at him in surprise. "Since when?" Samuel seemed uncomfortable with the question. "Since you arrived, the storage room doesn't block sound well." "I didn't want to disturb your rest with my comings and goings." "Oh." Penelope hadn't realized he'd been making this sacrifice for her comfort. "That's very considerate, but surely on a night like this, I'm fine here," Samuel insisted, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups and handing one to Penelope. She accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her cold hands around the warm metal. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the storm rage outside while the fire crackled and popped before them. "What was Philadelphia like at Christmas?" Samuel asked suddenly. Penelope smiled at the unexpected question. "Beautiful. Shop windows decorated with toys and candies, carolers in the streets, holly and evergreen wreaths on every door. My father always had the tallest tree in the neighborhood, decorated with glass ornaments and real candles." "Sounds nice," Samuel said, his voice wistful. "What about your family? How did you celebrate?" "Simply. Ma would make a special meal, ham if we could afford it, chicken if we couldn't. Pa always managed to find oranges for our stockings, even during the lean years. No fancy decorations, but Ma would string popcorn and cranberries for the mantel." "That sounds lovely too," Penelope said softly. "Different worlds," Samuel observed. "Yet here we are, sharing coffee in the middle of a blizzard." "Here we are," Penelope agreed, meeting his gaze across the small space between them. Something in his expression made her breath catch a warmth, an openness that hadn't been there before. Or perhaps it had, and she'd been too preoccupied to notice. "Penelope," Samuel began, his voice low and serious. "There's something I've been wanting to." A sudden violent gust of wind interrupted him, causing the cabin to creak ominously. Samuel was on his feet instantly, moving to check that the door remained securely barred against the storm. The moment broken, Penelope fought down a surge of disappointment. "Will the cabin hold?" "It stood through worse," Samuel assured her, returning to his place by the fire. Whatever he'd been about to say seemed forgotten or perhaps deliberately set aside. They finished their coffee in silence, the opportunity for deeper conversation lost to the howling wind and the late hour. Eventually, Penelope's exhaustion overcame her, and she drifted to sleep in the chair, lulled by the warmth of the fire and the comforting presence of Samuel nearby. She woke to find herself carefully tucked into Samuel's bedroll, a gentle hand shaking her shoulder. "Penelope," Samuel's voice came from somewhere above her. "Wake up. The storm's past." She opened her eyes to find early morning light filtering through the window. Samuel stood beside her, already dressed for outdoors. "What time is it?" she asked groggily. "Just after dawn. I need to check on the horses, make sure the stable roof held." He hesitated. "You should stay here where it's warm. I've built up the fire." Penelope sat up, pushing hair from her face. "I'll have breakfast ready when you return." Samuel nodded, something unreadable flickering in his eyes before he turned away. "I won't be long." True to his word, Samuel returned within the hour, bringing with him a blast of frigid air and the news that everything had weathered the storm intact. Penelope had coffee and hot cornmeal mush waiting, which he ate with appreciative noises that made her disproportionately pleased. The days following the blizzard fell into a pattern of necessary work, interspersed with quiet evenings by the fire. Samuel ventured out daily to tend the horses and check the property, while Penelope managed the domestic sphere of their shared life. Yet something had shifted between them. A new awareness that manifested in small ways, Samuel's hand lingering when he passed her the coffee, Penelope finding excuses to be in the same part of the cabin as him. Conversations that grew deeper and more personal as the winter nights stretched on. December brought Christmas preparations, modest though they were by necessity. Samuel returned from checking his trap lines one day with a small pine tree strapped to his back, its fragrance filling the cabin as he secured it in a corner. "It's not as grand as your father's trees," he apologized, "but I thought you might like to decorate it." Touched by his thoughtfulness, Penelope spent the afternoon creating ornaments from scraps of fabric, bits of colored paper saved from purchases at Wilson's store, and pine cones gathered in the fall. She strung popcorn as Samuel had described from his childhood, the simple task bringing unexpected joy. Samuel watched her work with evident pleasure, occasionally offering suggestions or helping to hang ornaments on the higher branches. When they finished, he lit a single precious candle and placed it carefully at the top of the tree. "Merry Christmas, Penelope," he said softly, standing beside her to admire their handiwork. "It's beautiful," she replied, leaning slightly against his shoulder. "Thank you." Samuel's arm came around her waist, the gesture natural and unforced. "I have something for you for Christmas. You didn't need to, I wanted to." Samuel reached into his pocket and produced a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. "It's nothing fancy, but when I saw it in Martha's store last month, I thought of you." Penelope unwrapped the gift to find a small silver hairpin, delicately crafted with a tiny flower at the end. "Oh, Samuel, it's lovely." "You mentioned once that you missed having pretty things," he explained, suddenly self-conscious. "I know it's not much." Penelope silenced him by rising on tiptoe to press a kiss to his cheek. "It's perfect, thank you." Samuel's arm tightened around her waist, and for a moment Penelope thought he might turn his head, might seek her lips with his own. Instead, he released her with obvious reluctance. "There's stew that needs tending," he said, his voice rough. Penelope nodded, understanding his hesitation even as she felt a pang of disappointment. Their situation was complicated. She was still technically his employee, dependent on him for shelter and livelihood. Any deeper relationship would require careful consideration by both of them. Christmas Day dawned clear and bitterly cold. Penelope woke early to find that Samuel had already been outside, the fire built up and coffee brewing. He entered as she was folding her bedding, stamping snow from his boots. "Merry Christmas," he greeted her, his face reddened from the cold. "Merry Christmas," she returned warmly. "You're up early." "Horses don't know it's a holiday," he replied with a smile, "but I did bring you something." From behind his back, he produced a small branch of holly, its red berries bright against the dark green leaves. "Where did you find this?" Penelope asked, delighted by the unexpected gift. "There's a stand of holly trees in the sheltered ravine to the south. Thought it might brighten the place up." He watched as she placed it on the mantel above the fireplace. "I have something else for you too." Before Penelope could protest that the hairpin had been more than enough, Samuel reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. "It's not much," he said, echoing his words from the night before, "but I thought you might like it." Penelope unwrapped the package carefully to reveal a small book of poetry, Tennyson's In Memoriam and other poems. The volume was clearly secondhand, its leather binding well worn but still handsome. "Samuel," she breathed, running her fingers over the embossed cover. "This is wonderful." "But how did you get it? I didn't see you buy it in town." "Wrote to a bookseller in St. Louis back in October," Samuel admitted. "Asked them to send anything by Tennyson or Wordsworth. This is what came on the last mail coach before the snow. You remembered I mentioned liking Tennyson." Penelope was genuinely touched by his thoughtfulness. Samuel shrugged, looking embarrassed. "You said his poems reminded you of your father's library." "Thank you," Penelope said sincerely. "This means more to me than I can express." "You're welcome." Samuel cleared his throat. "I should check the woodpile, make sure it's covered properly after last night's snow." As he turned to leave, Penelope called after him. "Wait, I have something for you too." She retrieved a package from beneath her bed, wrapped in a piece of calico tied with string. It's nothing compared to your gifts, but Samuel accepted the package with obvious surprise. You didn't have to get me anything. I wanted to, Penelope echoed his words from the previous evening. He unwrapped the gift to find a pair of leather gloves carefully stitched by hand. Penelope, these are excellent. Where did you get them? I made them, she admitted, suddenly shy. From that deer hide you brought back in November. Martha showed me how to tan it properly when we were in town. Samuel turned the gloves over in his hands, examining the neat stitching and careful construction. These must have taken weeks. I worked on them when you were out with the horses, Penelope explained. Do they fit? I had to guess at the size. Samuel pulled them on, flexing his fingers. Perfect. He looked at her with an expression that made her heart skip a beat. Thank you. No one's made me anything by hand since my mother died. The rest of Christmas Day passed in a gentle haze of contentment. They shared a special meal of venison roast, preserved vegetables from Martha Wilson's garden, and a simple cake Penelope had managed to create from their limited supplies. Samuel produced a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for the occasion, and they toasted the holiday by the light of the fire. As evening fell, they sat before the hearth, Penelope reading aloud from her new book of poetry while Samuel listened, his expression peaceful in the firelight. It was the most perfect Christmas either of them could remember in years, despite or perhaps because of its simplicity. The week between Christmas and New Year passed quietly, the weather holding steady with clear, cold days and star-filled nights. They established a pleasant routine, working together during daylight hours and sharing conversation by the fire in the evenings. On New Year's Eve, Samuel suggested they stay up to welcome 1875. It's tradition, he said, though I can't offer much in the way of celebration. Being warm and safe is celebration enough, Penelope assured him. I've had my fill of fancy parties and forced gaiety. As midnight approached, Samuel poured them each a small measure of whiskey. To the year ahead, he proposed, raising his cup. To the year ahead, Penelope echoed, taking a cautious sip of the fiery liquid. Outside, the night was perfectly still, the vast prairie silent under its blanket of snow. Inside the cabin, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and their own quiet breathing. Penelope, Samuel said suddenly, setting down his cup, there's something I need to say. She looked at him expectantly, her heart beginning to race at the intensity in his voice. These past months having you here. He paused, seeming to search for the right words. It's changed things, changed me. Changed you how? Penelope asked softly. Samuel met her gaze directly. Made me realize how empty my life was before, how much I'd accepted loneliness as my due. Samuel, please, let me finish. He took a deep breath. I know this arrangement between us was meant to be temporary, that you plan to move on when spring came, and if that's still what you want, I'll respect it, but I need you to know that He faltered, then continued with quiet determination. I care for you, Penelope, more than I thought possible. Penelope's breath caught in her throat, though she'd sensed the shift in their relationship. Hearing him articulate his feelings made them suddenly, overwhelmingly real. I'm not asking for anything, Samuel continued hurriedly. I just wanted you to know, before the new year begins, where I stand. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Penelope knew her response would shape whatever came next between them. I care for you too, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. These months with you have been unexpected in the best possible way. Relief washed over Samuel's features, followed quickly by cautious hope. Does that mean you might consider staying, not as my housekeeper, but as what? Penelope prompted when he didn't continue. Samuel met her gaze steadily. As my partner, my wife, eventually, if you were willing. The directness of his proposal took Penelope by surprise, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Samuel had always been straightforward, without artifice or game playing. I don't have much to offer, he continued when she didn't immediately respond. Just this land, the horses, and my promise to work every day to build something worthwhile, to make you happy. Tears pricked at Penelope's eyes. After everything she'd experienced, the loss of her family, the betrayal by her stepmother, the hardships of her journey west, Samuel's simple, honest declaration touched something deep within her. You've already made me happy, she told him, reaching across to take his hand. Happier than I've been in years. Is that a yes? Samuel asked, his voice rough with emotion. Instead of answering directly, Penelope rose from her chair and moved to stand before him. Slowly, giving him time to pull away if he wished, she bent down and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, but when Samuel's arms came around her waist, drawing her onto his lap, it deepened into something more urgent. Years of solitude and loneliness seemed to dissolve in that moment, replaced by a connection neither had dared to hope for. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I'll take that as a yes," he murmured. Penelope laughed softly. "Yes, Samuel Drake. Yes to staying. Yes to building a life here with you." As if in response to their decision, the cabin creaked gently around them, settling in the cold night air a familiar, comforting sound that now seemed like a blessing on their future together. Spring came late that year, the snow lingering into April before finally surrendering to warming temperatures and lengthening days. The prairie transformed almost overnight, brown grasses giving way to vibrant green shoots and wildflowers that carpeted the landscape in a riot of color. For Penelope and Samuel, the changing season brought new rhythms and expanded horizons after the close confinement of winter. Samuel spent long days working with his horses, training the younger animals and preparing the older ones for sale. Penelope planted a small vegetable garden beside the cabin, using seeds Martha Wilson had given her during their last visit to town. Their relationship had deepened over the remaining winter months, physical intimacy adding a new dimension to their already strong connection. Though they had agreed to wait until they could be properly married to fully consummate their relationship, their evenings were filled with increasingly passionate embraces and whispered promises for the future. In early May, when the trails had finally dried enough for reliable travel, they rode into Cedar Ridge together. The town was bustling with spring activity, freight wagons and travelers taking advantage of the improved weather to make up for time lost during the harsh winter. Their first stop was Wilson's Mercantile, where Martha greeted them with knowing smiles and barely concealed satisfaction at the obvious change in their relationship. "About time," she declared when Samuel formally announced their intention to marry. "I was beginning to think you two would dance around each other forever. We wanted to do things properly," Samuel explained, his hand resting possessively at the small of Penelope's back. "Well, you'll want to speak to Reverend Miller then," Martha advised. "He's in town for the next 3 days before continuing his circuit." With Martha's direction, they located the traveling minister at the small church at the edge of town. Reverend Miller, a kindly man in his 60s with a shock of white hair and twinkling eyes, agreed to perform the ceremony the following day. "Nothing elaborate," Samuel told Penelope as they left the church, "but at least it will be official." "That's all that matters to me," Penelope assured him, squeezing his hand. They spent the night at Mrs. Hollister's boarding house in separate rooms as propriety demanded. The following morning dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for a spring wedding. Penelope wore the best of her limited wardrobe, the blue calico dress she'd purchased during their first visit to town. Now carefully altered and adorned with a bit of lace, Martha had contributed as a wedding gift. Her hair was arranged simply but elegantly, Samuel's Christmas gift of the silver hairpin securing a small spray of wildflowers she'd gathered that morning. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, attended by the few people they'd come to know in Cedar Ridge. Martha Wilson, Mrs. Hollister, the schoolteacher who had been at the boarding house during their previous visit, and several townspeople who'd heard the news and were eager for any celebration after the long winter. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed Penelope with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. It wasn't the grand society wedding she might once have expected, but it was infinitely more genuine and joyful than anything she could have imagined during those dark days after leaving Philadelphia. They spent their wedding night at the boarding house, finally free to express the passion that had been building between them for months. Samuel's touch was both reverent and ardent, his hands and lips exploring Penelope's body with a thoroughness that left her breathless and trembling. "I love you," he whispered against her skin as they moved together in the darkness. "Have from the moment I found you on that trail. I love you too," Penelope gasped, arching against him as pleasure built within her. "More than I thought possible." Their joining was everything both had dreamed of during the long winter nights, tender yet passionate, a physical expression of the deep connection that had formed between them against all odds. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the narrow boarding house bed, Penelope rested her head on Samuel's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. "Happy?" he asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Completely," she assured him. "And you?" "More than I deserve," Samuel replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. They returned to the homestead the next day, no longer employer and employee but husband and wife, partners in every sense of the word. The cabin that had once seemed small now felt like the perfect beginning for their shared life. Summer brought long days of work and growth, both for the homestead and their relationship. Samuel's horse breeding business began to flourish, his reputation for quality stock spreading throughout the territory. Penelope's garden thrived under her care, providing fresh vegetables that supplemented their diet and preserved stores for the winter ahead. In July, during another visit to Cedar Ridge, Penelope purchased fabric to make curtains for the cabin windows and a proper quilt for their bed. These small domestic touches transformed the utilitarian structure into a true home, reflecting both their personalities and their shared vision. "Never thought I'd have curtains," Samuel remarked with amusement when she hung them. "Next you'll be wanting wallpaper." "Don't tempt me," Penelope teased, smoothing the simple cotton fabric into place. "Martha says they can order it from St. Louis now." Samuel caught her around the waist, pulling her against him. "Whatever makes you happy makes me happy," he murmured against her ear. "Curtains, wallpaper, even one of those fancy pump organs if that's what you want." Penelope turned in his arms, wrapping her own around his neck. "All I want is you. Everything else is just decoration." As summer gave way to autumn, Penelope began to suspect a new development in their lives. Her monthly courses, regular as clockwork since girlhood, failed to appear. At first, she dismissed it as the result of the physical changes her body had undergone since coming west, the hard work, different diet, and general stress of frontier life. But when a second month passed without the familiar signs, she could no longer ignore the possibility. She waited another week before sharing her suspicions with Samuel, wanting to be reasonably certain before raising his hopes. They were sitting on the bench outside the cabin one evening, watching the sun set over the prairie in a spectacular display of orange and purple, when Penelope decided the moment was right. "Samuel," she began, her voice soft with suppressed excitement, "I have news." He turned to her, eyebrows raised in question. "Good news, I hope, the best." She took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." Samuel's expression transformed from confusion to wonder in the space of a heartbeat. "A baby, you're sure?" Penelope nodded, tears of joy welling in her eyes. "As sure as I can be. It should arrive in early spring by my calculations." For a moment, Samuel seemed too overcome to speak. Then he gathered Penelope into his arms with exquisite gentleness, as if she had suddenly become infinitely fragile. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby. Are you happy?" Penelope asked, though his reaction left little doubt. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Samuel assured her. "I never thought, never dared hope for this much joy." In the weeks that followed, Samuel's protective instincts went into overdrive. He insisted Penelope rest more, took over the heavier household chores, and began planning additions to the cabin to accommodate their growing family. "We'll need another room," he declared, sketching plans at the table one evening. "And proper windows with glass, not just shutters. A bigger fireplace, too, for better heating in winter." Penelope watched him with fond amusement. "The baby won't need all that for quite some time, Samuel." "Maybe not," he conceded. "But you do. I want things to be easier for you, especially once the little one arrives." His concern touched her deeply, but Penelope was determined not to be treated as an invalid. "I'm pregnant, not sick," she reminded him gently. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, most of them while continuing to work." "Not my wife," Samuel insisted stubbornly. "Not if I can help it." They compromised eventually, with Penelope agreeing to avoid the heaviest work, while Samuel accepted that complete inactivity would drive her to distraction. Together, they prepared for both the coming winter and the spring arrival that would change their lives forever. In November, Exactly 1 year after Penelope had collapsed from hunger on the trail and Samuel had found her. They celebrated with a special dinner and quiet reflection on how dramatically their lives had changed. If someone had told me then that you'd become my wife, that we'd be expecting a child together. Samuel shook his head in wonder. I'd have thought them mad. Life has a way of surprising us, Penelope agreed, her hand resting on her now visible pregnancy. Especially when we're least expecting it. Samuel reached across the table to take her hand. Do you ever regret it? Coming west, I mean, leaving civilization behind? Penelope considered the question seriously. I miss certain things. Books mainly, music, hot baths whenever I want them. She smiled. But no, I don't regret it, not for a moment. This life, our life, is richer and more meaningful than anything I had before. Even with all the hardships, especially with the hardships, Penelope corrected gently, they've shown me what I'm capable of, what we're capable of together. Samuel's expression softened with love and pride. You're remarkable, Penelope Drake. So are you, husband. She squeezed his hand. So are you. Winter arrived early that year, the first heavy snow falling before Thanksgiving. But unlike the previous year, when the season had brought isolation and uncertainty, this winter was a time of joyful anticipation and planning. Samuel completed work on the additional room before the worst of the weather set in, creating a snug nursery adjacent to their bedroom. Penelope sewed baby clothes from fabric they'd purchased during their last trip to town, her needle flying as she created tiny gowns and blankets. Christmas was a quiet but happy celebration, their gifts to each other practical items for the baby and the expanded cabin. Samuel surprised Penelope with a rocking chair he'd ordered months earlier and kept hidden at a neighbor's homestead until he could retrieve it by sled. For nursing, he explained as she ran her hands over the smooth wood, and for telling stories to our child as they grow. It's perfect, Penelope assured him, already imagining the hours she would spend in that chair with their baby in her arms. As January gave way to February, Penelope's pregnancy advanced to its final stages. Her body grew increasingly unwieldy, simple tasks becoming challenges as the baby took up more space within her. Samuel watched her with a mixture of concern and awe, marveling at the changes in her body and the strength with which she bore them. You're sure we shouldn't go to town? He asked as her due date approached. There's a midwife there now, Martha wrote in her last letter, and risk getting caught in a blizzard on the way. Penelope shook her head firmly. Women have been giving birth at home for centuries, Samuel. I've read everything Martha could send us, and Mrs. Hollister shared her experiences too. We'll manage. Though he remained anxious, Samuel respected her decision. He made sure they had everything the baby might need: clean linens, a sturdy cradle he'd crafted himself, even a small store of special herbs Martha had recommended for easing the pain of childbirth. On a clear, cold night in early March, Penelope woke to the first contractions. She lay still for a moment, assessing the sensation, a tightening across her abdomen that was uncomfortable but not yet painful. Samuel, she whispered, touching his shoulder, I think it's starting. He was instantly alert, sitting up beside her. The baby now. Don't panic, Penelope advised, though her own heart was racing with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. First babies often take their time. We should try to rest while we can. Rest proved impossible for Samuel, who spent the next few hours alternating between hovering anxiously at Penelope's side and preparing the cabin for the birth. He built up the fire to keep the room warm, boiled water as Martha had instructed in her detailed letter, and arranged clean linens within easy reach. As dawn broke, Penelope's contractions intensified, coming closer together and lasting longer. She walked slowly around the cabin, finding that movement helped ease the discomfort. Samuel supported her as needed, his face a mask of concern that he tried valiantly to hide for her sake. You're doing wonderfully, he assured her, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead during a particularly strong contraction. So strong, so brave, Penelope managed a strained smile. Not much choice now, is there? By midday, the labor had progressed to the point where Penelope could no longer walk or talk through the contractions. She retreated to their bed, focusing inward on the tremendous work her body was doing. Samuel stayed by her side, holding her hand, wiping her brow and offering words of encouragement that he hoped masked his growing fear. The labor seemed to be taking too long, the pain too intense. What if something went wrong? What if he lost her, lost them both? As if sensing his thoughts, Penelope gripped his hand during a brief respite between contractions. "We're going to be fine," she promised, her voice weak but determined. "All of us." The final stage of labor came swiftly and intensely. Following Martha's written instructions, Samuel helped Penelope into a semi-upright position, supporting her back with pillows as she began to push. "I can see the head," he announced, his voice shaking with emotion. "Just a little more, Penelope, you're almost there." With a final, tremendous effort, Penelope brought their child into the world, a robust son with a shock of dark hair and a powerful set of lungs that he used immediately to announce his arrival. "A boy," Samuel said in wonder, carefully following Martha's instructions for tying off and cutting the cord. "We have a son, Penelope." Exhausted but radiant, Penelope reached for the baby as Samuel placed him on her chest. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We've been waiting for you." Samuel sat beside them on the bed, one arm around Penelope's shoulders, the other hand gently touching his son's tiny fingers. "He's perfect," he murmured, his own eyes wet with tears, "just like his mother." They named him William Thomas Drake William for Penelope's father, Thomas for Samuel's brother who had fallen at Gettysburg. As night fell on his birthday, the small family rested together in the cabin that had become a sanctuary of love and hope. Penelope drifted toward sleep, the baby nestled securely against her side. Before succumbing to exhaustion, she reached for Samuel's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" he asked, brushing a strand of hair from her damp forehead. "For finding me that day on the trail." "For putting food in my hand when I was starving," she smiled sleepily. "For everything that came after." Samuel pressed a gentle kiss to her lips. "I'm the one who should be thankful. You've given me more than I ever dreamed possible." As Penelope fell into exhausted slumber, Samuel kept watch over his wife and newborn son, his heart so full it seemed impossible to contain. From the depths of loneliness, he had found love. From the brink of starvation, Penelope had found life. Together, they had created a family and a future brighter than either could have imagined when fate brought them together on that dusty prairie trail. Outside, the winter stars shone brilliantly in the clear night sky, silent witnesses to the miracle of new life and enduring love that had blossomed in the wilderness of the American frontier.